and thank you all for joining us today. Warm welcome also from Murat and myself. It's wonderful to see you guys interested in this topic of business agility. And we think it's an important and timely topic that we've discussed in academia for a bit, but actually gained a lot of attention in corporate practice recently. And there's more and more companies that don't just want to adopt agile methodologies, but also agile ways of working in their organizations. So today we look at this topic from both an academic and a practitioner perspective. And it's a great honor and pleasure to welcome our two speakers. Our first speaker is Julian Birkinshaw, who's a professor of strategy and entrepreneurship at the London Business School. And as many of you know, Julian is also among the leading influential thinkers worldwide when it comes to management, but particularly also innovation, entrepreneurship, and renewal. And Julian will discuss how this notion of agility evolved in academia and entered the management world. Julian, it's great to have you with us today.
Thanks.
Our second speaker is Sarah Elk. Sarah is a partner at Bain Company, and she is co-author of a really popular book titled Doing Agile Right. And Sarah will share her insights from working with leading organizations on their agile transformation journey. Sarah, it's wonderful to have you with us. Thanks for taking the time.
Great to be here.
So just a few housekeeping details for those of you who just joined us a little bit later. We will have a Q&A function, so you can post your questions into the Q&A during the presentations. And then Murat and I will ask you to unmute yourselves later, and you can ask your questions yourself. So without further ado, Julian, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. I will share my slides and I will get going. So very great pleasure to be with you. I've been looking down the list of names and I recognize quite a few of you. The theme of agility, of course, has been around in some ways forever. I've been teaching a course at London Business School called Achieving Strategic Agility for about 15 years. And of course, agile has this generic meaning of adaptability to changing circumstances. But then around, I guess, about a decade ago, it became clear that agile was taking on a very specific definition, which I think most of you will know about, but I'll get into in a second. So I'm going to be talking both around the kind of the specific practice of agile working, but I'm also going to explore a little bit some of the context around why it came to be so popular and arguably why it might stop being popular at some point in the future. So the way I think of it is as follows, which is that for many, many years, I mean, as long as you like, we've been thinking about self-organizing, an alternative to top-down hierarchical organizing as a way of potentially helping our organizations work better. And you can, as I say, trace this back as far as you like. I'm going back to the socio-technical systems work of Emery and Trist in the 60s. And then you can look through the work of the likes of Warren Bennis and Henry Mintzberg, who use this term adhocracy, a term which I've also used. We can think about the self-organizing systems sort of movement with Kaufman and others, community of practice, holacracy, and so forth. And the point is not to try to be comprehensive here, just to try to say that there are underlying principles of organizing that are perennial, that are always part of our conversation, but the words we use to describe them vary. And the other point to make is that those innovations, if you like, in terms of organizing, happen both in the realms of theory, in the realms of the sort of things that we read and write, but also in the world of practice. In other words, we do actually see companies coming up with new, interesting, often better ways of working. And part of our role as academics is to kind of study and make sense of those things as a way of somehow providing more substance to our ideas. And there is absolutely a symbiosis between management theory on the one hand and management practice on the other. And again, I'll get into the specifics of what I mean by that. So when you say to yourself, where did the agile revolution of today come from? Most people would say it comes from the so-called Agile Manifesto, which was written, 21 years ago or something, by a bunch of very smart, progressive software developers. And they met in some American ski resort, and they wrote this manifesto for how computer programming could be done a whole lot better, using, as it were, agile techniques as the alternative to what used to be, and still I guess is called, waterfall management techniques. And for many years that was under the radar. People like me had never come across agile as a methodology until probably 5 or 10 years later. Then we saw that period when companies like Spotify, but many others as well, came into the world born agile, because of course Spotify is basically a software company. The people creating Spotify were agile types. And then they had the bright idea, of course, of saying, well, agile doesn't just have to be a methodology for developing software. We can actually use this as a way of essentially organizing all of our different activities. And so for Spotify, agile was the way that they organized everything. And many of you will have seen those very famous YouTube videos by Henrik Nieberg, which are kind of referred to here. And then the kind of mainstream shift, if you like, where agile went from being this thing which only digital companies or IT companies did to being part of the everyday work of large companies. I'm going to say that happened over the last 7 or 8 years. And indeed, Sarah's co-author, Darryl Rigby, is one of the authors of this article in Harvard Business Review called Embracing Agile, one of several articles in this recent period, which has helped to contextualize agile as a way for every company to potentially work. Now, don't think that I'm going to suggest that it is the solution to all our problems. It is not. Like any management practice, agile has its pros and its cons. And ING Corporation, the big Dutch bank, has become a little bit of a standard bearer for this movement of agile going into the mainstream. And indeed, I, among many others, spent some time in ING, 5, 6 years ago, writing up the story of how they had done a big bang kind of transformation of their head office operations. They took literally 2,000, 3,000 people and transformed them into agile teams with a significant degree of success. And whoever you ask, they're going to give you a different answer. I've certainly heard some people say that it's not been as successful as they would like it to believe, but that always happens because you can never definitively say that one particular innovation has worked. There are so many confounding factors at play. So it has been successful enough that the ING agile transformation has, as I said, become a little bit emblematic of what other big companies can and might do. And just for those of you who are a little bit newer to the topic, let me just give you the headline of what they did. It was a way of working where they essentially divided all of the head office activities, setting aside a bunch of compliance type people, and they put them into so-called squads or agile teams. And they allowed those teams to be self-managing. And self-managing means essentially setting your own deadlines, setting your own objectives, having your own kind of purpose as almost a mini organization. And then obviously working in cycles, rapid cycles with your customers in order to rapidly get through a backlog of work and to deliver it hopefully quicker and better. And the idea is that it's both more efficient and more effective. You actually get things done more quickly and you are more creative and more attentive to your consumers' needs. So that's the essence of what agile is. And then there's a whole paraphernalia, which we're not going to talk about today, of how these agile teams or squads then get aggregated up in terms of doing stuff in a way that is aligned to the overall, to some degree, top-down goals of the organization as a whole. And the method by which they do that is challenging. As I say, we could talk about it because it's quite interesting to see how they've done it. But suffice it to say that's one of the challenges of Agile, is that self-organized teams at some point have to meet the reality of a coordinated offering, and a pledge to shareholders and other stakeholders about what you're going to deliver. So it was a success, as I say, a qualified success, but a success nonetheless. And I get asked all the time by people in other companies to say, can we do what ING has done? I remember a big Italian insurance company having this very long conversation with me about, we want to be like ING. And my answer to that question is almost always, well, ING was in a slightly unusual place in terms of their capacity to actually put in place an agile revolution. And what I've listed there is a whole series of the elements, almost preconditions within ING that allowed them to make it a success. And it became clear to me when I was talking to this Italian insurance company that they weren't actually well equipped to do what ING had done. They didn't have those preconditions, quite honestly, to actually deliver on it. So they had to do something a little bit smaller and more self-contained. So that is part one of my talk. Let me just spend 5 minutes now before handing over to Sarah, giving you a little bit of a critical perspective, by which I mean, let me stand back from the specifics and let me put on my sociologist's hat in terms of saying, this is an interesting example of a management innovation that has become incredibly popular. And this is following from the work of Eric Abrahamson and others. It is worth asking ourselves, why has it become popular? And what is going to happen to this trend? Because it's not obvious to me that it's going to continue to do well for the foreseeable future. And the starting point for that analysis is this notion that there is a marketplace for management ideas. And as with any market, there are buyers and there are sellers. On the supply side, in other words, the people or entities who are propagating new ideas, you have people like us, academics, who are trying to get a name for themselves by coming up with something new or talking about something fairly new. We have consultants, and consultants make a living, of course, by selling their services and selling their services to large numbers of companies and ideally large packages of solutions. And we also have pioneering practitioners. Now, you might say, why are they on the supply side? And some of them are and some of them aren't. But it is very often the case that the new ideas actually come from practitioners who have an idea and then want to almost become famous for having had that idea. And then on the demand side, you have, you've got I'll take the bottom part first, the trends in society, the zeitgeist, if you want to call it that, of, the world is changing fast. We need to be accelerating to keep up with that trend. And that's about digitization, and it's about sustainability and all sorts of things happening in the world that we're conscious that we need to stay sort of amenable to. So we do see those macro trends. And then what we see, of course, is executives in companies who have a problem to solve. They've got some sort of need, that they're not hitting their numbers. They're trying to make a name for themselves. Things are too complex. They need a solution. They need some way, some vehicle to take their problem and resolve it, and to do so in a way that makes them look good to their boss and their boss's boss and everybody around them. And so, in some shape or form, executives are always in the market for the latest thinking. And of course, that market works very well to the extent that there's always people buying and people selling. And Agile is just the latest in a long, long string of management ideas, management fads and fashions, which have taken off. And I'll just give you one brief example. You might remember the balanced scorecard from the 1990s. Where did that come from? Well, on the picture there, you see a guy called Art Schneiderman, who was an executive at Analog Devices. He was actually the inventor of the balanced scorecard. But the guy on the left is Robert Kaplan, who is a very well-known Harvard professor, who's, of course, written the book on the balanced scorecard. And it turned out that the balanced scorecard took off because it was a combination of Art Schneiderman trying something else out new and Bob Kaplan picking up on it and saying, aha, here's a really cool idea that I can now package and sell to the world. And I'm just going to finish up now, but just two final points before I close. It does strike me that as you look at the rise and then the fall of management ideas, that eventually all good ideas and all companies doing innovative things fall out of favor. Some companies do really cool stuff and then they grow up and they become less innovative. Sometimes companies, and there's a great example that the Danish company, hearing aid company called Oticon, do start something very innovative, but gradually over time they kind of revert back to a more normal way of working. And then occasionally you get an example like Enron, which was hugely innovative in a number of interesting ways. But of course, it also found to be fraudulent. And as a result, their fraudulent activities ended up killing off all of the relatively interesting management ideas that they had because they all got tarred with the same brush. And so we see this rise and fall over time. And it's fascinating to me as an academic that it's always the academics who are kind of the last to the party. So what this chart says is if you take Oticon's spaghetti organization, which is an example I just touched on earlier, it was, of course, the journalists who got there first, then the consultants. And then a few years later, a bunch of academics started writing about it after the thing had actually finished, in fact. So I'm afraid on occasions like this, academics do not actually come out of it looking too good. Yes, we make some very interesting observations about what happened, but usually we do it after the party is over. So the story is that over time, any innovative practice, and I'm going to hypothesize that this is happening to Agile right now, is that some of the companies doing it aren't actually necessarily doing that well for that long because other things get in the way. Sometimes the consultancies selling those practices actually push it too hard. And before you think I'm criticizing the next speaker, I'm actually not talking about Bain or BCG and McKinsey. I'm talking about some of these alliances of people who sell black belts and sort of certifications in doing Agile. I think they're the ones who actually are to some degree giving Agile a bad name. And eventually interest in the practice wanes, attention goes elsewhere. And unfortunately, what often ends up happening is that the innovative practice actually gets tarnished, which is a real shame because it means that often very good ideas, very sensible ideas actually get thrown out. The baby gets thrown out with the bathwater and we move on to something else. So that's all I wanted to say. For me, Agile is a set of techniques which are fundamentally inherently sensible and smart. They help with this practice of self-organizing, which has always been a part of the kind of the set of things that we're trying to help organizations to get better at. But it does have this downside that any management fashion has, which is that sooner or later, the concept loses favor and then we move on to something else. Often very similar thing, but just with a slightly different name. And a little plug, this isn't in any way competitive to SMS. I'm actually guest editing a special issue of California Management Review, which is more kind of practitioner-oriented research. Some of you will be aware of this. If you have an interest in writing a paper for it, by all means, just drop me a note and I will tell you how to submit to that special issue. Okay, there you go. So hopefully that wasn't too long. It was about 15 minutes. I will stop talking now. Over to you, Patricia.
Excellent, Julian. Thank you so much for sharing these rich insights in terms of how agility actually evolved over the years and, connecting it to the dots a little bit in our world of strategic management. And also for raising some provocative statements. I think Sarah is the perfect candidate actually to respond to that. So Sarah, do you want to take over from here?
Great. Let me just do this. I think Julian actually set up why we wrote the book really well. We too are worried that Agile will end up on the management mania scrap heap, so to speak. So as you mentioned, we've been students of Agile for a long time. Agile has been around quite a long time, but has gained popularity recently. And so the genesis of writing Doing Agile Right is exactly what Julian described. And for us as practitioners, the ambition is clear. So the world is changing very quickly. We need to figure out how to succeed and thrive in this changing world. And the goal is actually not to be agile. The goal is to deliver superior results. And that's for all of our stakeholders, for our customers, for our employees, importantly, of course, shareholders, but also our communities. And so how do we begin to think about how we use Agile to accelerate our strategy and what we're trying to achieve in the world, as opposed to making Agile the end goal? So what is going wrong, and why is Agile helpful? We think about two lenses on this. One is running the business, so if we call that operations sort of generically, and the other is changing the business, which is innovation. The challenge is that bureaucracy, which is not inherently bad, has stifled innovation. So when we're running our business, we're trying to really be focused on quality and efficiency. And in doing that and overusing that muscle almost, we've reduced variation, and in effect have stifled innovation. Whereas when we're focused on changing the business, we're actually trying to introduce variation. And so it isn't that these things are inherently good or bad, it's that we need both. And we've overused our bureaucratic muscles and allowed that to extend in a way that we just aren't changing our business as much or as quickly as we need to. And so how do we harmonize both of these things? And so we would actually not put Agile everywhere in the organization. We think approvals and standard operating procedures are good. They just need to be fit for purpose in the right places and harmonized. And this happens at an individual team level, and it happens at an organizational level. So when we think about any individual Agile team, it starts with a definition. So, while these teams are in a sense self-organizing against their objective, leadership plays a really critical role in setting a stretching objective for every single team. And often when we come into organizations, that is a gap. And so when we think about readiness to launch of any given team, it starts with a clear stretching objective, again, tied to strategy. What are you trying to achieve? How am I trying to change the business? And then the team goes through discovery, design, develop solutions against those objectives. And then importantly, has a partner in the run the business, whether that's a warehouse, a retail store, a geography, it could be an internal customer or parts of the organization that is your partner in developing that solution. So that is my customer who I'm prototyping for and providing feedback back into the design process. And so I'm actually creating an iterative cycle and bringing that harmonization across run the business and change the business, even at an individual team level. When you do that across lots of different strategy missions, you end up with a picture illustratively like this. And so you have the Agile leadership team at the top. We call that an Agile leadership team, even though they're not necessarily running Scrum, because they play a really critical role in setting these stretching outcomes, and they guide the process of becoming a more Agile organization. Within your business units or in your functions, you'll have Agile teams. So the little red circles are meant to represent teams or collection of teams. And notice that there's lots of gray bars here, which represent everybody else in your organization. Again, we do not believe that your whole organization should be operating with Agile practices. Agile values and mindsets are great everywhere to be consumer-centric, to understand the value of prototyping, et cetera. But we need people to run the business with standard operating procedures. And again, those are good things. We place Agile teams near the operations that must adopt or scale them. That also is a bit of a difference than what we've seen in practice. Some people like to group the Agile teams together and sort of put them to the side, but they need access to that expertise in order to scale, and coming up with ideas is the easy part. Scaling them into your organization and realizing the results is the hard part. So just quickly, we believe in using Agile to become Agile. So, opposite of what the ING Big Bang transformation would be, we think that you should start with some teams and transition over time, figuring out what works in your organization and scaling it. In a lot of cases, it's tailoring practices and methodologies to your culture, and even coming up with your own nomenclature for what you want to call your way of working. Over time, you might end up with probably 10 or 20% of your employee base in Agile teams. Again, most of your folks that are in your company are still doing routine operations and running the business, even once you've matured the model. But it's not just about Agile teams. You also need to think about what is the rest of the operating model elements that are in service of those teams. So if I only stand up Agile teams, it isn't enough. And what was interesting since we published the book, and we've had lots of conversations with different kinds of companies, but even sort of household names that would be viewed as, very technology oriented, some of them even digital natives, some of them with thousands of Agile teams, they would tell you that they are still on the journey of making their business system more Agile because they do not have leadership in place in the right way. Their funding and planning systems are not as finely tuned as they can or should be in support of Agile teams. Et cetera, et cetera. And so how do we start to think about some of those other operating model elements? This is how we we think about that. So starting in the top left, it's all about leadership and culture. Management system for us is how we think about setting strategy priorities, how that translates into resource allocation, and then business reviews. So sort of the collection of management processes. Structure and accountabilities is relatively straightforward. The accountabilities matter more than the structure. Oftentimes companies are leading with structure change, and that's actually not necessary to become more agile, and a lot of times that gets in the way. Your talent engine is about your talent systems and processes in addition to the people that you have. And then business process obviously needs to support, and then often is a focus of Agile teams to simplify and streamline business process. These are the human elements that support those teams. Technology and data is obviously important and an enabler of that. But again, this is about looking at your strategy and figuring out how you use these teams to flow the work to the teams instead of the people to the work in a way that's going to drive results. So when you do that, what happens? In our experience, where the top team spends their time changes dramatically. So what was a overemphasis on operations becomes a more balanced set of time and attention towards strategy and growth. And that comes in the form of more focus on prioritization, again, setting, stretching definitions and outcomes for these teams, removing impediments and getting things out of the way of these teams so that they can be successful. The other thing I'll note is that while the talent bucket is largely the same proportion of time, how that time is spent can change dramatically. It's a lot more individual coaching as opposed to participation in talent processes. And then routine operations does get delegated down, again, with the perspective of the executive team. And then what we find is that over time, those that are doing this well have a productivity advantage relative to the rest of the companies that we're looking at, and it's substantial. And that compounds daily, weekly, et cetera. So by 10 a.m. on Thursday, these companies are getting done what it takes the rest of the companies to get done all week. And a lot of that has to do with how talent is being teamed and led as the primary difference. And so I'll just leave you with a few quick tips. Again, this is about using Agile to become more agile, where Agile is not the end goal. We don't believe that you should put Agile everywhere. It's important to launch Agile teams well when you launch them, again, with specific missions in mind. Standardizing your approaches to that to create one organization with one mission that you're leading towards results is important. This does help you move away from boss-centric norms when you set the teams up right to be more consumer-centric. That is a journey. It does take time. Breaking work down into small batches, you probably have to create new feedback loops that don't exist today to support these teams so that they can prototype and iterate in the right way. Decision rights are really important so things can move swiftly. You will end up changing what your goals are and what your metrics are in support of this as you go through. And ultimately, management ends up spending a lot of time reprioritizing. It is nearly impossible for management teams to stop. It's, in all of my years, you can try to create stop lists. It's nearly impossible, but it is so much easier to reprioritize. Shifting resources onto something that's a higher priority is so much easier. So put the emphasis there and accelerating towards the things that you really want to be changing in your business can be really fun. And our perspective is that if it's not a fun journey, then you're probably not doing it right. So I will stop there and turn it back over to you, Patricia.
Excellent, Sarah. Thank you so much for this. And I think this gives us a lot of food for thought. I'd like to kick off the discussion with a point made by both of you. So Julian mentioned that in the ING case, it was essential that the leaders gave up their sense of control, right? And you also mentioned, Sarah, how essential it is to have like support by executives for agility. And I know that you make this point quite often also in the book. So whenever I, work with companies on agile transformations, I feel that initially everyone, including the executives, are actually excited about this concept of agility. The more they learn about it, the less they become excited, but they want to kind of experiment with this. And then throughout the agile journey, actually they fall back into this micromanagement mindset. So how can top executives really support agile transformation journeys? We're not talking experimenting with a few agile teams, but really thinking about embedding it where it makes sense in the organization. How can executives avoid, or how can you support executives avoiding this micromanagement mindset? Any of you, feel free to answer that question.
Sarah, do you want to go first? I mean, I'm
Go for it, Julian.
So, look, I've seen that. Of course, I have. We've all seen that. In other words, the notion that agile requires top executives to let go, to accept the idea that that power should be devolved. And it's very easy for any top executive to say that they believe in letting go, that they believe in empowering. And of course, many of them actually mean it, but there's a big difference in letting go when things are going well and letting go when things are going badly. And exactly as you say, it's a bumpy road. Sooner or later, once the initial kind of excitement of putting this thing in place wears off, you get to a point where something isn't going right, and then you figure out who is actually genuinely prepared to accept that things are that they're not in control. And not in control means literally being able to say to your boss, I don't know the answer to that, but the person in my team can tell you the answer to that. I mean, most people really hate that feeling of almost like, I don't know, but I've deliberately tried to get somebody else along. So there is no simple solution, right? In other words, the top team has to genuinely own that as a concept, that we are going to devolve power, and they've got to own it sufficiently that they can kind of look at each other and admit that right now, even though times are tough, we are going to stick the course, because as soon as they revert back to their old favorite behaviors of being in charge of everything, then you know that everyone underneath them will all follow suit, and they will all go back to telling their people what to do. So I don't think there's a simple solution here, but clearly it has to be owned by the team who have put this thing in place in the first place. Sarah, you must have seen this as well, right?
Of course. I think two things I would say. One is, it's really difficult to tell senior leaders what to do. Mm. And so a different approach would be to help them self-discover it. And for leaders who have spent the vast majority of their career being expected to know the answer and have the expertise, telling them to behave differently is often just not a strategy that will work. And so how do you create the conditions in which they will experience something differently and self-discover that they can, that they're getting in the way and they're the impediment? And oftentimes there's a moment, in the last client I had, it was sort of 4 to 6 months in, where the leader sort of in the middle of a meeting was like, oh my gosh, I'm the impediment. And you can create those conditions. So that would be one thing, which I think is consistent with this idea of, if I'm going to be a know-it-all, then I've got to sort of do that in a path and a time and a space that's right for me. And I mean know-it-all in the best sense of that. The second thing I would say is that ultimately it's the leader's job to build the trustworthiness of their team. And so if, like, the most common reaction, particularly on this delegation point, is are you asking me not to run my business, right? Like, you'll see sort of the 3-year time chart and say, okay, well, so much of that operations is being shifted to the next level down, like, but it's my job to run the business. Like, what are we talking about? And, and then you get but my team isn't ready, or I can't possibly delegate that to my team. But you have to shift that mindset to say, but it's actually your job as the leader to make that person ready. So if that person's not ready, it's on you, it's not on them. Yeah. And so what are you doing proactively to make that person more ready if you feel that they're not? And I'm not asking you to take undue risk in your business. Like, you as a leader are going to know that. That's great. But at the same time, there are things that you can and should be doing to build the readiness of your team to be able to take those activities. And you probably aren't thinking about that day to day. So, if I've got a teenager who just got his driver's permit, he'll be driving soon, As soon as he gets his license, I'm not going to hand him the keys and say, go drive all your friends around on a Saturday night, like, good luck. I'm going to say, get in the car, drive to the corner store, get the gallon of milk or eggs or whatever, and drive home. And so there's going to be small baby steps. Maybe it's a sales meeting, maybe it's, they handle, some aspect of the operation on their own, but they need to do that in steps.
One little footnote. There's a fascinating kind of national culture overlay here. In other words, the guy who put in place the original ING experiment transformation, he was headhunted to run a large Russian bank. I won't name it, but there's only a few options. And he only had very modest success in Russia. And he then moved on to another organization in Germany. And I guess we shouldn't be too surprised, because the sort of behaviors we're looking at here, if you go back to your original kind of Hofstadter dimensions around power distance and collectivism and uncertainty avoidance and so forth, I mean, it's quite clear that the type of working we're looking for here is requiring a certain set of behaviors, which some people are just more attuned to than others.
Excellent answers. Thank you both. We have an interesting question from Kun. Kun, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes. Thanks very much for organizing, Patricia, Murat, and thanks, Julian and Sarah. Thanks so much for your presentations. Really interesting to learn about Agile in greater detail from both perspectives. I was wondering, maybe I can share a question at Sarah to following up on some of the the results that you're finding and that you're projecting on your working Agile. On Agile, you were indicating, how actually the executive time allocation shifted over, from non-Agile to the Agile reality, if understood correctly, relating to how ops and strategy amongst three categories were dropping from 60 to 25%, and strategy going up 10 to 40% in terms of time spent on that activity. I was wondering, and then you were on, I think, your next slide, talking about what were the outcome consequences of, and I was wondering, can you say a little bit more, perhaps, about how the ops versus strategy outcomes were affected? I think my underlying question is, if given that there's such a big shift particularly on what is spent on operations, is there then extra layers typically, or that are brought in to actually see that operations results are being achieved, or how, given such a big drop, how do operations continue to to get their standard operating procedures and just their general activities moving forward? Love to hear more. Thanks so much, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a belief that there's untapped potential in the people that you already have in your organization, and that you're just not using people to their full potential. So they're not working more hours. They're working with more clear objective in terms of what their team mission is, or what their contribution is to the overall goal or outcome of what you're trying to achieve as an entity. But nothing gets sacrificed. Like, that's sort of the aha for these leaders. Like, nothing gets sacrificed when their time shifts. The potential of their team is there. They just have to tap it. And that's true up and down the organization. And so our belief is that there's a huge asset that's sitting in most companies, which is just the untapped potential of the talent that's there on the basis of how they're led, and how they're viewed, and how they're engaged with, and how they're inspired. And when you can shift people from being, satisfied to engaged to inspired, and you see potential in them, it changes how you engage them and how you team them, and what their missions are.
Very nice. I see that Nacho has raised his hand. Nacho, would you like to ask for a question?
Thanks, Murat. I made a big effort to type it, and I'm gonna hopefully say it right. And I don't mean to be rude at all with what I'm going to say, but if it has been suggested that perhaps well, typically people who say that they're going to be rude, they're not going to be rude, they end up being rude. But I genuinely don't mean to be rude. If it has been suggested that perhaps Agile is approaching maturity, and there's a bit of being afraid of perhaps the fad will go down fashion, and also that academics tend to come late to these fads or at the last minute, then I wonder why the special issue on the California Management Review now, or perhaps is it what's the purpose of the special issue?
No, it's great. I delight in your question. I mean, so all I can say is I'm not going to be defensive here. I'm going to say the fact that we're having a special issue now is entirely symptomatic of the phenomenon I just described, which is that agility is a concept which has grabbed a lot of attention. A lot of people are writing about it. I mean, fortunately, it is a very flexible concept. In other words, it is quite possible that you can take that concept and take it in any number of directions. And sometimes, entire research streams emerge, in slightly unexpected ways. So you're absolutely right. That special issue should probably have been launched 4 or 5 years earlier, but so be it. I mean, I think there's still enough opportunity in the concept of agility broadly defined. I mean, if I thought somebody was going to write an article about the very narrow techniques of Scrum, let's say, then I would not be excited, right? I think that really is something we now understand quite well. But, the notion of agility, like ambidexterity or goodness knows what other concepts you like, these are flexible, malleable concepts which can help us to explore a number of different topics.
Julian, so I take your special issue as the notion that the party isn't over yet, right? So we could still jump, you should still join.
It's a different party. I mean, I actually mean that. I mean, this is a special issue which is absolutely pragmatic, if you like, or agnostic with regard to exactly how someone chooses to define the word agile. I mean, it is one of the most flexible words out there. I mean, who doesn't want agility in some form as a trait for a business?
Great,
I will say from the practitioner lens, it is increasing in demand and popularity still.
Okay, well, that's good. But there are still companies out there. I mean, I remember doing it with a client recently, and they said, don't mention agile, like call it responsiveness or adaptability or something, anything except agile, because agile's now got a bad name. I mean, I'm not saying that's normal, but there are some companies that have kind of gone through the cycle, and others which are still climbing the cycle.
Yes, there's a world of lovers and haters of this concept, right? Yeah. You both nicely actually mapped out how Agile has profound implications for organizations' design, right? I mean, we speak strategy, but we should also speak more of culture, structure, processes. So what do you think would be interesting in terms of future research, avenues, topics, both with respect to the special issue, but also maybe from Sarah's perspective, what challenges, do you still encounter along these Agile transformation journeys where you would appreciate academics to look more closely into these challenges?
Yeah. Do you want to go first?
Yep, Julian, go ahead.
Okay. So, I mean, the way I see it is as follows, which is that the Agile movement has set in place a lot of changes within companies that are, I mean, they're always well-intentioned, but they're obviously proceeding at different paces and in slightly different directions. And those changes, of course, do end up impacting all different aspects of organizations. And as scholars, one of the things, particularly those of us who study kind of research within organizations, so I'm not talking about people who build large data sets of archival materials, but those of us who study what happens within organizations, the Agile Revolution has opened up lots of experiments within companies. So I'll just give you one specific example of what I mean. For Agile to work, we have to fundamentally rethink our resource allocation systems, our budgeting systems, the means by which we figure out what sort of activities get resources allocated to them, because suddenly we've got a whole lot more bottom-up input into that process than we had before. So, a whole conversation around performance management and budgeting and resource allocation is now underway as we try to make agile work. And of course, some companies are doing it well, others are really struggling. So I can think of, and the same in human resource areas and innovation and so forth. You can absolutely use the agile transformation as a lever, if you like, or as an intervention that allows us to study all these other things that we're interested in. And there's no limits to the list of things that we might study in that regard.
I guess when I think there's a lot to be learned in terms of what do we believe about leadership and what actually makes a good leader in the future. And so the idea that I need to be smarter and more expert and have all the answers in me and tell those to my team, there's a ton written on that. But what does that mean in terms of how do we teach leadership then? Like, what does the leader do? Yeah. And how does the leader have impact if I'm not supposed to bring all the answers? And I think that is I don't think we are either in practice or in academia teaching leaders that yet at full potential. I think there's room to still figure that out. And I would love to, I don't know what the research would be, but I would love to see anything that helps crack open this idea that when we look at somebody, there's more potential in them than we're actually tapping into or utilizing. And how do we help leaders bring that perspective more than you're the person who's going to execute the task that I'm telling them? I will counter that with saying I do believe that it is the leader's job to set the outcome and the objective and the goal of teams coming together. I don't believe that a fully bottom-up sort of self-organizing organization will work. I think somebody's got to set the mission and the direction, and it's the leader's job to do that.
Very nice. Thank you both. We have two questions, challenging questions from Katie. Katie, would you like to ask your questions, please?
Sure. Hi, Julian. Hi, Sarah. Interesting conversation. Thank you. And good to see you, Julian.
Yep. Very nice to meet you again. To see you. I can't see you, unfortunately, but I can hear you.
Oh, I can see you. You look better than ever.
Yeah.
Oh. Anyway, no, two questions for you. One is it struck me, is Agile inherently an unstable task, like you know, unstable management system, like skiing way too fast and you just barely have it under control. So so it's inherently unstable. And secondly, how is Agile intersecting with machine learning, algorithms, that sort of thing? So I had the two questions.
Well, let me have a go. So look, I mean, you wrote the book literally on Edge of Chaos. So you won't be surprised to know that I actually do think of Agile as deliberately trying to get onto that sort of that knife edge, if you like, where we are creating a high degree of fluidity in terms of how teams act, and keeping it more or less under control. And certainly when I've looked at companies who've been doing Agile for a while, you absolutely see some cases, or many cases actually, where, you know, notwithstanding Sarah's point, you should be having more fun, absolutely you should, but some people get exhausted by it. I mean, and I've seen absolutely some companies revert back because it was harder work working in Agile teams than working in a more pedestrian way. And of course, some people love that and some people just don't actually want that. So that's a quick thought on your first question. The second question, I'm going to answer by way of an example. I was running a session just last week with a guy called Charles Towers Clark. He created a little company called the Pod Group. And he had the bright idea that the problem with machine learning and artificial intelligence, particularly for professionals, white collar workers, is that it is to some degree taking some of their responsibilities and opportunities away by automating many of the jobs that they used to do. And so he actually believes that sort of the self-organizing trend, the idea that we should actually sort of take away management authority, sort of kills two birds with one stone. He believes that it actually is both a way of ensuring that we focus on the kind of the more valuable tasks that we need to do so that we can actually, you know, help happily kind of give up and automate the things that artificial intelligence can do, as well as, of course, to having all the benefits that we've been talking about on this session. So I think they come together quite nicely in that respect.
I guess in answer to your first question, I would say it's definitively the opposite. So it's not unstable, and in fact, it actually increases stability, because now I'm taking dedicated resources and putting them against very specific missions to change my business, which requires that I actually know how I want to change my business, and I'm putting persistent teams against that. So as opposed to 92 projects where I might be taking fragments of leadership time, and because they're not fully dedicated, I can actually in an infinite way fractionalize my leadership team or any resource in my company, because I can just keep pushing more priorities, which ends up slowing everything down, and I don't actually achieve any change, which is what's happening at a lot of companies today. Instead of that, I'm actually forced to prioritize because I'm putting fully dedicated resources in the form of these teams against the most important missions. There's a backstop to that. I can't shift everybody onto change the business resources. So I actually have to be more planful, more thoughtful, more prioritized, more stable. And again, I can reprioritize these teams as my strategy and sort of important missions evolve, but it requires me to be more planful, not less. And Agile is definitely not the absence of planning. Quickly on the sort of algorithm and data science question, I think you see a lot of that in process reimagination. So where teams are focused on process and automation comes in, but there are also a lot of customer facing applications where we see a lot of machine learning. A lot of that is just embedded in data science inside of Agile teams, also can sit outside, but definitely seeing a lot of that.
Can I mean, tell me if this is appropriate or not, but I want to understand why I disagree with Sarah's point on Agile teams being stable, because I completely buy your argument that, you know, we've got a whole set of opportunities, challenges in the business world. We are putting teams on those challenges. And of course, by default, they should be doing that. And yet I've seen, you know, empirical evidence, I suspect you have as well, that sometimes this way of working often devolves back to something a little bit more traditional and a lot more structured. And I don't know quite why that is, but one possible answer is that we've all grown so comfortable with traditional hierarchical ways of organizing over the years that you know, as soon as things don't go quite right, we kind of revert back to type, and type in large organizations is indeed, you know, tight central control. So I don't know if you agree with that, Sarah. I'm just trying to square your observation with the reality I've seen.
Yeah, so I think it can't be a big bang. I think you have to take Agile, and I think the teams have to be focused on things that are at the heart of value for the company. So it can't be things that are on the fringe. It has to be things that are in the heart of how you want to change the business, which gets leadership time and attention and gets them to define, again, a stretching outcome. Has to be stretching because then the leadership team can't dictate the answer. So when you've got a stretching outcome that forces you to prototype and iterate and test and learn, and you've set up a testing partner in the business that creates a feedback loop or a customer segment, et cetera. If you have that set up well with fully dedicated resources, because then I have to prioritize it, you will see differential progress. And when you have that kind of momentum, then you can start to get the other things out of the way. So like on your funding and planning challenge, which can often be a major impediment that forces you to revert back the other way, you address that by having a strategic holdback. So you have to have an ability to release funds throughout the year, because I want to invest solutions at the point that they're ready to scale. When you do that, you know, you're not budgeting for them up in advance, but at the point that I'm then investing to scale them, I actually know what the economics are. I have more clarity because I've placed a bet on a bunch of different solution designs and iterations. I'm making the bigger investment to scale when it's actually more known what that's going to look like when I build it into my annual plan, let's say. So there are really practical ways that you can start to adapt the broader way of working and how you're running your business to be in service of helping these teams thrive. And I think when you're doing that, you don't see companies revert. You actually see the continued positive momentum. But you see it over a period of multiple years, right? Like it's not going to be flip the switch tomorrow. You're going to see it on a 2 to 5 year time horizon.
Yeah, I was just going to just push back a little bit. It seems like though it's a technique where you have to keep paying attention. You have to keep prioritizing. You have to keep paying attention. And if you go out for lunch, you fall off the rails. So that's what I meant by is inherently unstable. You have to keep always paying attention, reprioritizing, thinking through what you're doing. You can't take a vacation in some sense from it.
Yeah, I would say our recommendation is that the leadership team prioritize quarterly. That doesn't seem too burdensome for me. I think that's the leadership team's job.
Thank you very much, Katie. And just to add that, it's also a little bit scary for executives because it's the principle of self-management. They lose a bit of control, and perhaps that's the impression of chaos. I want to thank you all for joining this presentation, a webinar, especially to Julian, Sarah, and Patricia for organizing and sharing their insights. Just to summarize 2 takeaways on my side. Julian said that Agile is yet another business fashion and it is dying, yet he has a special issue coming. He is considered submitting. Yeah. At the same time, Sarah says, no, party is raving, and this time as academics, you shouldn't be late to this party. Again, thank you very much all for joining today. Thank you.